He was crouched beside his old pickup truck in the quiet early morning. Sleeves rolled up, hands blackened with grease. Focused on a stubborn bolt that had refused to move for the last 10 minutes. And to anyone passing by, he looked like nothing more than an aging mechanic keeping an aging vehicle alive. The kind of man people no longer noticed. A man whose best years they assumed were far behind him. Yet inside his calm blue eyes lived memories of skies, torn open by afterburner flames and radios crackling with life or death urgency. Memories he rarely visited anymore, because civilian life had taught him that the past was something people preferred you keep buried. Especially when it involved things they could never understand. And so he lived quietly on the edge of town, fixing engines, helping neighbors, never mentioning the years he had spent answering calls no one else could. The years when his call sign had carried weight in rooms filled with steel and urgency. When his name had meant solutions instead of questions. And as he leaned back to wipe sweat from his brow that morning, he felt content in the simple rhythm of turning wrenches and listening to birds instead of alarms. Unaware that somewhere far away a situation was unfolding that would rip the present wide open and drag his past straight back into the light. Because in a hardened operations room thousands of miles away, a fighter squadron commander stared at a screen filled with red indicators and shifting data. Knowing that standard protocols were failing, that simulations didn't cover what they were facing, and that the pilots under his command were running out of time. And when one of the younger officers hesitated before speaking a name that hadn't been officially listed in years, the room went quiet because everyone there understood what that name represented. Not rank or authority, but capability. A rare alignment of instinct, experience, and calm under impossible pressure. And when the commander finally nodded and said the words "Request Iron Eagle immediately," there was no drama in his voice, only resignation to the truth that sometimes the old ways were the only ways that worked. And back in the small town, the veteran felt it before he heard it, a strange tightening in his chest. The kind he hadn't felt since the last time he'd been scrambled without warning. He paused, listening, telling himself it was nothing. That the war was long over for him, that no one would come looking. Yet moments later his phone vibrated in his pocket. A sound so ordinary, and yet so heavy with meaning that his hands trembled slightly as he pulled it out. Staring at a number that was not saved, but was burned into his memory so deeply he could have dialed it blindfolded. And for a long second he considered letting it ring, considered finishing the repair, considered the comfort of pretending he was just an old man with an old truck. But the ringing continued, relentless, patient. And finally he answered with a simple hello. His voice steady despite the storm he felt rising behind his ribs. And on the other end, there was no greeting. Only a measured tone that cut straight to the point. "We need you," and he closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. Because some calls never needed explanations, they carried their own gravity. And as the voice continued outlining a situation that sounded too familiar, too close to scenarios he had lived through in darker days, his gaze drifted to the horizon where the sky stretched wide and empty. The same sky that had once been his battlefield. And when the voice finally asked if he was available, there was a pause, a respectful one. Because even now they understood that this was not an order. It was a request, and in that silence memories flooded back. Not of glory or medals, but of faces, of pilots who had trusted his guidance, of missions that had ended because he had been there, and also of the cost, the sleepless nights, the strain. The reason he had walked away when he finally could, choosing grease-stained hands over command rooms and red alerts. And yet, as he listened to the urgency creeping into the voice on the line, he knew the answer before he spoke it, because some responsibilities did not expire. They only went quiet until the moment they were needed again. And so he said yes, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet affirmation that carried more weight than any oath. And the moment the call ended, he felt the shift. the subtle but undeniable return of a mindset he had set aside. He stood up straighter, his movements more deliberate, his thoughts already organizing, prioritizing. And as he looked down at his truck, he smiled faintly, patting the hood as if thanking it for the years of faithful service, knowing it would wait because it always had. And within an hour, a black vehicle rolled into his driveway, unmarked, efficient, its presence startling in a place where nothing ever happened. Neighbors peeking through curtains, whispering, trying to reconcile the image of the quiet old man with the precision of the people who stepped out to meet him. But he paid them no mind as he climbed into the back seat, answering questions with brief nods, his attention already shifting toward the unknown ahead. And as the town disappeared behind them, he felt no fear, only focus. The same calm that had once made others rely on him when systems failed and plans collapsed. And during the flight that followed, surrounded by screens and briefings, he absorbed information rapidly, asking only the questions that mattered, identifying gaps, patterns, possibilities, surprising younger analysts who had only read about him in declassified summaries. And when one of them finally asked why him, why now, he simply replied, because this problem doesn't care how new your training is. It cares whether you understand it. And as they neared the base where the squadron waited, tension hung thick in the air, pilots moving with forced confidence, mechanics working faster than usual. And when he stepped onto the tarmac, conversations stopped. Not out of reverence but recognition, the kind that comes when people sense competence without needing proof. And he walked straight to the operations room, setting down his bag, scanning the displays, already seeing what others had missed. And as he began to speak, calmly outlining a revised approach that reframed the entire situation, the room leaned in because despite the years, despite the civilian clothes and weathered face, Iron Eagle had returned, not as a relic of the past, but as the answer to a present that had run out of options. And somewhere far away his truck sat quietly in the driveway, unfinished but not forgotten, waiting for the day he would return to finish the job, unaware that its owner had once again stepped into a world where hesitation cost lives and experience was the sharpest weapon of all. The room stayed silent for several seconds after he finished speaking, not because anyone doubted him, but because the clarity he brought cut through hours of confusion like a blade. And the commander finally nodded, giving a short order that sent teams moving instantly. Pilots adjusting flight plans, analysts recalculating parameters, and the veteran stood there with his arms crossed, watching the machinery of urgency realign itself around a simpler truth he had learned long ago, that chaos often looks complex until you stop fighting it and start listening to it. And as the first jets began to roll out onto the runway, he stepped closer to the main display, pointing out a subtle timing window that only appeared if you thought like the threat instead of reacting to it. And one by one the red indicators shifted to amber. Not solved but manageable, buying precious minutes. And in that moment, the younger officers understood why his call sign still carried weight. Because he didn't overwhelm the room with authority. He anchored it with calm, and as the jets lifted into the sky he took a seat, hands resting lightly on the table, eyes never leaving the feeds, listening to radio chatter that felt like a language he had never forgotten. Each clipped phrase painting a picture more vivid than any screen. And when turbulence hit the formation, he anticipated it before the pilots reported it, offering guidance that sounded almost intuitive, yet was built on years of hard lessons learned when intuition had been sharpened by survival. And outside the base the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the tarmac. But inside the operations room time compressed into heartbeats and decisions. And when the first unexpected complication arose, something the models had not predicted, he didn't flinch, instead leaning forward, voice steady as he rerouted assets, adjusting roles mid-mission in a way that would have seemed reckless to those bound strictly by protocol. But protocol had never saved anyone on its own. People did. And minutes later, when the threat began to unravel, Pilots reporting regained control and reduced risk. A quiet exhale moved through the room, though no one celebrated yet. Because the veteran hadn't moved, hadn't relaxed. He knew better than to assume an ending before it arrived. And it was only when the final confirmation came through that he allowed himself a small nod, as if checking off a box only he could see. And the commander turned to him, gratitude clear but unspoken. Because words felt insufficient, and as teams began post-mission procedures, some shaking hands, others slumping into chairs, the veteran finally stood, stepping away from the screens, the adrenaline ebbing slowly, replaced by a familiar fatigue he had not missed. And one of the pilots approached him, helmet under his arm, eyes intense with a mix of relief and awe, thanking him not as a subordinate, but as someone who knew their life had hinged on guidance, given at exactly the right moment. And he accepted it with a brief nod, telling the pilot to get some rest. Because survival was never about glory, it was about being ready again tomorrow. And later that night in a quieter office, the commander asked him to stay longer, to advise on long-term adjustments, hinting at offers, at positions, at a possible return that went beyond a single emergency. And the veteran listened patiently, staring at a framed photograph on the wall of a squadron long retired, feeling the weight of that suggestion settle on his shoulders, heavier than any gear he had worn. And he didn't answer immediately, because he had learned that the most dangerous decisions were the ones made too quickly, and instead he asked for time. Stepping outside into the cool night air, looking up at the stars, the same stars he had navigated by when instruments failed and trust mattered more than certainty. And he thought about his truck, half-fixed, waiting without complaint, about the quiet mornings, about the promise he had made to himself to live smaller, safer. And yet he also thought about the look in the pilot's eyes, about the reality that experience unused was not humility but waste. And as dawn approached, he returned inside, giving the commander an answer that surprised no one and yet changed everything. He would help, but on his terms. Not as a symbol, not as a permanent fixture, but as a bridge between generations, someone who could teach without commanding, guide without lingering. And the commander agreed, understanding that Iron Eagle had never been about rank. It had been about presence. And days later, as he prepared to leave the base, bags packed lighter than before, he walked once more across the tarmac. Jets lined up in disciplined silence, and he felt a sense of closure he hadn't known he was missing. Because he realized he didn't have to choose between who he had been and who he was now. He could be both when it mattered. And when the black vehicle dropped him back at his quiet home, the world felt unchanged. Neighbors still mowing lawns, birds still calling, and his truck still waiting patiently. And as he rolled up his sleeves and returned to the stubborn bolt, he smiled to himself, knowing that somewhere far away, systems were stronger, people were safer, and a call sign once thought retired had proven that some legacies don't fade. They simply wait for the moment they are needed again. Weeks passed after his return, and life settled back into its familiar rhythm. The truck finally fixed, the mornings quiet again. Yet something subtle had changed, not in the town or the routine, but inside him. Because once you answer a call like that, you don't simply close the door afterward, even if you step back into civilian clothes. And every so often his phone would buzz with a message that carried no urgency, but plenty of intent. Questions from analysts, clarifications from instructors, brief audio clips sent late at night asking for his thoughts. And he responded when needed, concisely, never inserting himself where he wasn't required, fulfilling the promise he had made to help without hovering. And in training rooms far away, younger pilots began to hear stories not about him, but about decisions made during that mission. Case studies that quietly reshaped doctrine. And although his name was rarely spoken aloud, the influence was unmistakable, because the solutions bore his signature simplicity. And back home people noticed only small things, like how he listened a bit more intently to the weather reports, or how he sometimes paused to watch planes crossing high above, tracking them instinctively until they vanished into the blue. And one afternoon a local kid wandered over while he was working on the truck again, asking innocent questions about engines that slowly drifted toward questions about flying. And the veteran answered honestly but without embellishment, explaining principles rather than stories, because he knew that fascination grew best when fed with understanding instead of myth. And as months went by, the world beyond the town grew louder. Tensions rising, headlines filled with speculation. And once again, the systems he had helped refine were tested, this time without his direct involvement. And when the reports came in that the outcome had been stable, controlled, effective, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction, knowing that the goal had never been to be needed again, but to make sure others could stand without him. And one evening as the sun dipped low, he received a final call from the commander, not requesting help, not asking advice, but simply informing him that the standing contingency that carried his call sign had been officially retired, not erased but archived as complete. Mission fulfilled, and the veteran listened quietly, absorbing the meaning behind those words. Because this time it felt different, not like abandonment or fading relevance, but like a chapter properly closed. And after the call ended, he sat for a long while on the tailgate of his truck, listening to the cicadas, feeling the weight lift gently instead of tearing away. And in that stillness he realized that what had been requested of Iron Eagle had never truly been about him at all. It had been about continuity, about ensuring that hard-earned wisdom did not vanish when uniforms were folded and titles removed. And now that continuity existed beyond him, living in people who would never know his face, but would make better decisions because of his influence. And days later, he was invited to a small gathering at a nearby airfield. Not a ceremony, no speeches, just a quiet flyover conducted by pilots he had never formally met. A gesture not of spectacle but of respect. And as the aircraft passed overhead in perfect alignment, he felt no urge to stand straighter or salute. Instead, he placed a hand on the truck beside him, grounding himself in the present, understanding that identity was not defined by what answered your name, but by what endured after you stepped aside. And when the sky cleared, he drove home slowly, windows down, dust trailing behind him, feeling complete in a way he hadn't expected. Because he had learned that legends were not meant to linger forever in the spotlight. They were meant to appear exactly when needed and disappear just as quietly, leaving the world steadier than they found it. And that night as he turned off the light and settled into sleep, the sky outside remained calm, silent, and secure. Not because Iron Eagle was waiting on standby, but because he had taught others how to fly without him. And that, more than any urgent request or dramatic return, was the truest victory he had ever achieved.